The endless white horizon merged with the heavy gray sky into a single cold mass. The old icebreaker was completely blocked by huge ice floes in the heart of the harsh northern ocean. The piercing Arctic wind howled loudly as it swept across the snow-covered metal decks of the lonely ship. Captain Konstantin Badigin stood silently on the bridge and stared intently at this dead icy desert. At that moment, they did not yet know that they had ceased to be explorers and had become mere survivors. The air temperature outside was dropping rapidly and relentlessly with each passing hour of darkness. Heavy multi-year ice crushed the blackened wooden hull of the defenseless ship with a frightening creak. Every day, young hydrographer Viktor Bunitsky carefully measured the thickness of the merciless ice shell. His frost-bitten fingers struggled to hold the heavy, cold metal measuring instruments. On that frosty day, the arduous polar expedition came to a definitive and irrevocable end. A long, exhausting, and incredibly cruel struggle for survival against utterly impossible natural conditions began. The ocean showed no mercy or hidden malice toward the stranded people, remaining completely indifferent. Everything was decided here and now, on this tiny island of warmth in the midst of a vast white death. An unbearably long journey awaited them, and no one knew who would be able to make it to the end. The end of October 1937 brought the first real Arctic frost to the ship. The expedition was initially full of confidence in its abilities and had a clear goal of exploring the northern seas. Experienced sailors carefully prepared for the voyage, gathering the necessary supplies and checking the complex equipment. They hoped to quickly complete the planned route and return home before the onset of the most severe cold weather. However, the powerful elements made their own cruel adjustments to these bold human plans. The ship's movement became slower and more difficult with every nautical mile traveled. Huge ice floes continuously pounded against the ship's sides, creating a dull and frightening drumbeat. Captain Badigin spent long hours on the bridge, trying to find a safe passage through the ice. Thick fog often obscured dangerous sections of the route, forcing the ship to navigate almost blindly. At first, no one on board wanted to utter the words forced and dangerous wintering. In the evening, Captain Badigin gathered the entire exhausted crew in the cramped and cold wardroom. People's faces were pale and tense in the dim light of the only oil lamp. In a calm and even voice, he announced that the ship would remain wintered in the ice. A heavy and oppressive silence hung in the air, louder than any cry. Everything changed in a second, and no one was ready for what would happen to them next. The nature surrounding the ship seemed like a huge and invincible beast slowly clenching its jaws. The dull crack of breaking ice constantly reminded people of their incredible fragility and vulnerability. From that day on, the tense Arctic expedition finally ceased to exist. Sailors, mechanics, and scientists became just a group of people doomed to brutal survival. Supplies on board were limited, and ahead of them lay a winter of unknown duration. The question was no longer about achieving scientific goals, but about preserving their own human lives. None of them knew whether the crew would survive the approaching long polar night. Soon, the huge pale sun disappeared forever behind the gray and lifeless horizon. A long and pitch-black polar night fell, covering the ship with a thick and heavy black veil. The absence of daylight affected the morale of the crew more than the intensifying frost. The world shrank to the size of a small spot of light cast by rare kerosene lamps. The darkness beyond the cabin walls seemed alive, hostile, and ready to engulf the entire ship. Every morning, Konstantin Badigin checked the outside thermometers by the light of a dim handheld flashlight. The mercury was rapidly dropping lower and lower, breaking the -40°C mark. The frosty air became so dense that it seemed possible to cut it with an ordinary knife. Going out on the open deck became a deadly dangerous and incredibly painful activity. The cold brought people together during the day while they worked and cruelly separated them in the dark of night. Viktor Bunitsky continued his scientific observations despite the terrible weather conditions. He went out onto the ice, tied with a strong safety rope to the metal handrails of the icebreaker. His hands, encased in thick mittens, were almost unresponsive, refusing to make accurate entries in his logbook. The young man's face quickly became covered with painful white spots of severe frostbite. He continued to work solely because stopping in these conditions meant death. Inside the ship, the temperature also began to gradually and inexorably drop each week. Coal for the steam boilers had to be conserved as much as possible for future survival. People slept in their outer clothing, covered with all the thin blankets and old jackets they could find. In the morning, they found their thick beards and hair frozen to the hard pillows. The breath of the sleeping people turned into tiny ice crystals that slowly settled on the walls. The silence of the polar night was broken only by the ominous creaking of ice squeezing the wooden hull. This terrifying sound became their constant companion, reminding them of the imminent threat. The crew began to economize on words just as they economized on scarce food and precious heat. Conversations became short, dry, and concerned only the most necessary everyday matters. The most dangerous internal enemy was not the bitter cold, but growing mistrust and severe fatigue. At first, they tried to maintain some semblance of normal life by organizing occasional group readings. Dr. Dmitry Trofimov tried to keep up the team's spirits by telling interesting stories from the past, but soon the cold and constant hunger took over all other human needs. People started sitting still for hours, staring blankly at one spot in front of them. Panic inside the closed rooms spread among people much faster than the cold. They still believed that large-scale search parties would be organized on the distant mainland, but everyone on board understood perfectly well that rescue was simply impossible in the polar night. Help could only come in the spring, and they had to somehow manage to survive until then. The days merged into one endless, dark strip of suffering, devoid of any sense of time. They no longer counted the days that had passed. They maniacally counted their slim chances of success. The men had to carry heavy loaded rifles with them every time they ventured out onto the slippery ice. Their gaze was constantly drawn to the endless black void that concealed mortal danger. The outside world was too far away, and here everything was governed solely by the harsh laws of the North. By the end of the first month of the polar night, the crew fully realized the scale of their terrible tragedy. It was at that moment that their usual iron discipline began to crack. They looked at each other in the dim light and saw only deep, primal fear. The hope for a happy escape could not change the icy reality that surrounded them. Nature made no distinction between the captain, the scientist, or the ordinary sailor. The only thin thread connecting the doomed icebreaker to the outside world was the ship's radio station. The radio operator sat for hours in the cold radio room, trying to transmit important coordinates through heavy interference. The sound of Morse code seemed like a life-saving music, proving that they still existed in the world. However, the severe magnetic storms of the Arctic began to mercilessly cut off this fragile line of communication. For days on end, only a continuous, ominous crackling and the cold hiss of emptiness could be heard on the airwaves. Captain Badigin stood gloomily behind the radio operator, watching his unsuccessful and nervous attempts. The loss of communication meant complete and final isolation from the rest of humanity. In those moments, the men felt as if they were buried alive under a thick layer of black ice. The realization of absolute deafness and muteness fell upon the crew like a heavy and suffocating stone press. Now no one on Earth knew their exact location and current physical condition. They continued to write their diaries, hoping that these records would one day be found by rescuers. The world continued to live its busy life, but for this icebreaker, time had completely stopped. The most frightening thing about this situation was not the physical pain, but the complete information silence. Attempts to restore radio communication continued every day, becoming an obsession for the crew. People gave up the last bits of warmth from their bodies, trying to warm up the frozen batteries with their hands. Communication was not restored after a week, nor after a long and painful polar month. The icebreaker Georgy Sedov turned into a real ghost ship, drifting in a nameless void. The horizon remained completely empty on all sides, and everyone on board understood this. No one in the whole world could hear their cries, locked inside the frozen iron bulkheads. From that moment on, their terrible and cold time became their most important and merciless enemy. Thick, multi-year ice was never in a state of absolute and calm repose. Ocean currents and strong winds constantly set the vast white fields in threatening motion. In such terrifying moments, a real natural and insane apocalypse began around the icebreaker. Huge chunks of ice crashed into each other with a terrible roar, forming high ice mountains. The hull of the old ship shook from the monstrous blows, as if from heavy artillery shells. During one of these powerful compressions, the ice broke through the thick plating below the ship's waterline. Icy black water instantly poured into the dark and narrow hold with tremendous force. Captain Badigin personally directed the ship's rescue operation, standing knee-deep in icy water. The sailors desperately tried to patch the hole from the inside with logs, mattresses, and cement. The frozen water instantly burned the skin on their hands, turning their limbs into numb pieces of flesh. They worked almost without rest, realizing that if the ship sank, there would be nowhere to escape. There was no way back. Everything was decided in those terrible minutes. Badigin watched in horror as the steel bulkheads in his cabin slowly deformed. He understood that the strength of the materials had long been exceeded by the laws of physics. Nature showed no hurry to kill these people quickly and painlessly. It simply crushed their only protective shelter with its ice, slowly, day after day. Each new blow from the elements robbed the exhausted crew of what little confidence in physical strength they had left. It was the turning point when they stopped hoping for the technical power of the icebreaker. They were left alone with the indifferent cold, relying only on their own hands. After the ship was partially flooded, the struggle for its survival became a daily routine. The ice continued to advance slowly, and the men had to constantly chip it away from the wooden sides. This exhausting work took place at temperatures below 40 degrees and in a piercing wind. Tools broke from the severe cold, and the wooden handles of the ice picks quickly became unusable. People went out onto the ice in small groups, as staying in the cold for long periods of time was suicidal. Working with heavy crowbars required enormous physical effort from bodies already severely weakened by hunger. Striking the diamond-hard ice caused sharp, intense pain in their weakened joints. Their breath caught instantly, and the sweat from their exertions quickly turned to ice under their clothes. Konstantin Badigin worked alongside his sailors, setting a personal example of fortitude and stubbornness. None of them wanted to take responsibility for the possible death of the entire crew. Dr. Trofimov examined people's hands and faces daily, recording new cases of severe frostbite. The skin on the affected areas turned black and peeled off, causing people unbearable physical suffering. There was a catastrophic shortage of medicines, and the doctor had to use only simple bandages. People slowly began to turn into living ghosts with sunken eyes and blackened faces. At first, it seemed like a temporary misfortune, but then it turned into a harsh and inevitable sentence. By the end of the harsh winter week, many sailors were physically unable to get out of their bunks. The ship was slowly turning into a floating ice hospital full of moaning and exhausted people. Badigin looked at his comrades and realized that their collective strength was almost exhausted. At that terrible moment, all their lives depended solely on their own stubbornness. It was the day after which all hope of a quick rescue died completely. The supplies of quality food on the stranded ship were reaching a critically dangerous level. Initially, the expedition had expected a short voyage, and the storerooms had not been stocked for years to come. Daily food rations were cut back every week, turning into meager, insignificant portions. Breakfast consisted of a piece of hard, dry bread and a mug of warm, cloudy water instead of strong tea. Everyone understood that food resources were not infinite and would soon run out completely. Hunger did not strike the crew suddenly. It crept up very slowly and was incredibly painful. At first, it was a slight, unpleasant gnawing sensation in the stomach that could easily be ignored. Then there was constant physical weakness, causing people to move more slowly and clumsily. People began to lose weight rapidly. Their faces became gaunt, and their eyes sank deep into their sockets. No one wanted to say the word hunger out loud, as if afraid of inviting even greater misfortune. Every morning began with the agonizing counting of the remaining cans of food and bags of grain. The quartermaster handed out food with such a mournful face, as if he were measuring out the last hours of their lives. Cooking became a sacred and very strict ritual, watched by everyone present. The smell of food caused people to salivate profusely and experience nervous, uncontrollable muscle tremors. The most frightening thing about this ordeal was that they did not know the exact date when their suffering would end. It was that terrible period when hope became a thin and almost invisible thread. People began to stare into the deafening polar darkness for long periods of time, as if expecting a miraculous deliverance from it. However, the horizon remained completely empty, and everyone knew it deep down. No one was prepared for such a long and painful agony in the middle of the icy Arctic desert. The question was no longer whether they would be rescued, but whether the rescuers would find them alive. When the short and cold polar summer of 1938 finally ended, the ice had not melted. Hopes for the ship's natural release were completely dashed when the open water around it began to freeze again. The crew realized with unspeakable horror that they would have to endure another terrible winter in captivity. The realization of this grim fact hit their morale harder than the strongest storm. A second winter meant certain and agonizing death from inevitable exhaustion and terrible cold. Preparations for the second winter took place in an atmosphere of complete despair and deep, overwhelming apathy. The men mechanically performed the familiar tasks of insulating the damaged hull and conserving fuel. They sewed up huge gaps in the hull with old sails and stuffed them with dirty straw. The sailors' movements were slow, sluggish, and devoid of any meaningful enthusiasm. No one believed anymore that these pitiful measures could protect them from the impending record cold. They were no longer explorers. They were not even real survivors anymore. They had become silent witnesses to their own slow and painful end. The second winter became the true and absolute limit of human physical and spiritual capabilities. None of the crew ever thought that a person could endure such enormous suffering. They survived not because of their physical strength, but in defiance of all laws of biology and logic. Each day they lived was a real miracle that they did not expect or ask for. It was the moment when they mentally said goodbye to their distant and warm home. Time turned into an endless, viscous loop in which there were no days of the week or exact dates. The horizon remained as empty and black as it had been a year ago, promising no salvation. They lay in the darkness, listening to the howling of the north wind, and waited for their inevitable and cold end. No one had prepared these brave people for such total and hopeless loneliness in the ice. Their terrible Arctic story was slowly but surely coming to its logical and sad conclusion. The physical torment of cold and hunger gradually faded into the background in the face of madness. Deprived of normal nutrition and light, the brain began to play very cruel games with the survivors. These frightening visions did not cause him fear. They brought him a strange and sick comfort. The real world was too cruel and unbearable, so the mind took refuge in safe hallucinations. He was not prepared for his mind to slowly and inexorably begin to crumble from within. The silence on the ship became absolutely toxic, poisoning their consciousness worse than any carbon monoxide. The sound of a metal object falling could drive an exhausted person into a real hysterical fit. They began to flinch at every sharp sound, like frightened wild animals cornered. Their own human minds, which had lost control, became their most dangerous enemy in these conditions. They were still physically breathing, but morally they had long been dead. Dr. Trofimov watched with horror as signs of mass insanity spread among the remaining sailors. He noticed people wandering aimlessly through the narrow corridors for long periods of time, muttering incoherent words. He had no sedatives to alleviate their mental suffering in any way. Medicine was completely powerless in the face of such a global, psychological catastrophe. Some already clearly understood that even if they were miraculously rescued, they would never be the same again. In rare moments of clarity, they looked with horror at their dirty, unshaven faces. They saw before them not proud explorers of the North, but pitiful, degraded subhumans. Their sense of dignity had been irretrievably lost in the struggle for an extra piece of rotten bread. The world continued to exist in its purity, but for them, reality had narrowed to icy mud. They began to understand that there would be no more help and that they would remain here to rot forever. Psychological destruction became the final and most terrible chord of their Arctic trap. None of them knew if this pitiful remnant of the crew would survive their next nightmarish night. The horizon remained completely empty, depriving them of even the faintest hope of imminent deliverance. At first it seemed like a short delay, then a sentence, and now it had become a veritable hell. And in this man-made icy hell, there was no room for foolish optimism and false illusions. At the end of 1939, an event occurred that seemed like a mirage to everyone. At the very edge of the endless, black horizon, a tiny, barely noticeable glimmer of bright light appeared. At first, no one on board the icebreaker paid the slightest attention to it. The exhausted people were too deeply immersed in their personal depressive hallucinations and pain. They still believed that they were being searched for, but their tired eyes refused to believe the real facts. Viktor Bunicki was the first to realize that this strange rhythmic light was not the aurora borealis. With great difficulty, he crawled onto the icy deck, clinging to the handrails with his frozen hands. His heart, long unaccustomed to strong emotions, suddenly began to beat wildly and painfully in his chest. He shouted hoarsely, urging the rest of the crew to come out into the terrible, piercing cold. No one heard his faint cry, swallowed up by the loud noise of the incessant Arctic wind. Huge chunks of ice creaked eerily as they moved aside, giving way to the steel giant. At that moment, the freezing people ceased to be doomed prisoners and became rescued sailors once again. They began to realize that help had indeed arrived and that they would not be left here to rot in the ice. When the two ships finally came alongside each other, wooden gangways were immediately thrown between them. The rescuers rushed onto the deck of the Sedov, catching people who were falling from incredible exhaustion. Doctors immediately began to provide the necessary first aid, distributing the sick among warm cabins. Hot tea and soft bread seemed like the food of mythical gods to the rescued sailors. The most frightening thing was the ringing silence that had now been replaced by the saving hum of human voices. Rescue came at the very last and most critical moment, when there was almost no hope left. The Arctic finally released its prey, allowing people to escape from its icy, deadly embrace. It was the end of their incredible drift, but the beginning of a long journey to physical and spiritual recovery. None of them forgot those terrible days when they were left alone with the white void. Nature simply waited, but they proved to be much more stubborn and stronger than its cold indifference. The return journey to the mainland took place in a completely surreal, warm, and safe atmosphere. The rescued crew members of the icebreaker Georgy Sedov spent most of their time sleeping in comfortable beds. Their heroic drift in the ice instantly became a legend, widely reported in all the major newspapers. Their courage and unprecedented fortitude were held up as an example to future generations of intrepid polar explorers. But the surviving sailors themselves rarely and very reluctantly told journalists the true details of their wintering. They did not want to remember those moments when fear and hunger deprived them of their human form. For them, it was not a grand adventure, but a dirty, cruel, and humiliating struggle for survival. Doctors strongly recommended that the rescued people undergo a long course of psychological rehabilitation in sanatoriums. Many of them were never able to return to a full normal life and work in noisy cities. The silence of the Arctic desert continued to call them back in disturbing and realistic nightmares. They continued to mechanically ration their food and flinch at every sharp sound in an empty room. The most difficult test was adapting to a society that had never known real, deadly cold. The experience gained during this terrible drift became invaluable to the entire world of science. The records of Viktor Bunicki and other scientists formed the basis of new theories about the movement of polar ice. Their suffering brought real benefits to humanity, although they themselves never sought such fame. They were simply trying to survive in conditions where nature itself was categorically opposed to their existence. From that moment on, time for them was divided into life before the drift and life after liberation. The story of the icebreaker Georgy Sedov became a harsh reminder of the colossal power and indifference of the Arctic. Man can create the most perfect machines, but in the face of the elements, he remains only a weak speck of dust. Nature makes no allowances for titles, scientific achievements, or lofty human ambitions. It obeys only its own cruel and eternal laws, knowing no pity or compassion. This was the main and most difficult lesson that the surviving sailors learned from their icy captivity. Many decades later, this story continues to stir the minds of people interested in real survival. It proves that the limits of human endurance are much further than we can imagine. Strength of spirit and the will to live can work miracles even when all logical chances are zero. The icebreaker's crew proved this with their own bodies, blood, and broken minds in the polar ice. They have forever inscribed their names in the cold and ruthless history of the conquest of the world's north. The final point in this unprecedented drift was not marked by a solemn and loud reception. It was marked in the soul of each rescued sailor when he fell asleep peacefully for the first time without fear. The Arctic did not try to kill them quickly. It simply waited for them to make a mistake for 812 long days. But they withstood this monstrous pressure and were able to return home alive and unbroken. Their ordeal ended, leaving behind only the echo of icy silence in the boundless memory of the ocean.